He knew exactly what he was doing. That's the only way to explain what Toto Wolff said into a microphone after the Belgian Grand Prix, in front of cameras, in front of Sky Sports, in front of everyone who was paying attention. And almost nobody was paying attention. That's the part that should bother you. Here's what happened on the surface. Lewis Hamilton got a 5-second penalty for a collision with George Russell at the Les Combes chicane. It ended Hamilton's race. Ferrari was furious over the radio. The stewards ruled Hamilton wholly at fault. Clean story, right? Driver makes contact, driver gets punished, everybody moves on. Except George Russell, the driver who was hit, didn't want the penalty. He called it a racing incident himself in the media pen, on record. And then Toto Wolff, the team principal of the team Russell drives for, agreed with him, publicly, on camera, overruling the stewards of Formula One in defense of the driver who ended his own driver's race. You've probably seen the headline. What you probably didn't sit with is the question underneath it. Why would a team boss go out of his way to protect the man who took his own driver out of the race? Keep that question in your back pocket. It comes back, and when it does, it changes how you read this whole weekend. If you want the stories the paddock doesn't put in the press releases, the quotes that reveal more than they're supposed to, subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from, because what Wolff said next hits differently depending on where you sit in this rivalry. Let's lay out exactly what was said, because the wording matters more than you think. Speaking to Sky Sports F1 after the race, Wolff addressed the collision directly. His quote, translated from the broadcast, he described the move as a case of trying the outside, where it should have been Hamilton's corner. But ultimately, in his words, a racing incident, something that can happen whether you're fighting at the front, in the middle, or at the back of the field. Sit with that phrasing for a second. Wolff isn't saying Hamilton was innocent. He's saying the collision doesn't deserve to be punished at all, that it's simply part of racing. That's a direct contradiction of the stewards, who ruled Hamilton wholly at fault and handed down a time penalty that cost him a podium finish. And here's the part that doesn't add up if you take it at face value. Martin Brundle, watching from the commentary booth, cleared Russell of any blame in the incident too, but he was surprised the stewards punished it at all, given they usually set a higher bar for first lap contact. So you have the analyst surprised by the penalty, you have the victim saying he didn't need it, and now you have the team principal of the victim's team going on record to say the penalty made no sense. 3 separate voices, from 3 separate positions in the paddock, converging on the same conclusion. A conclusion that runs directly against the steward's official verdict, which brings us to the real question. If nobody close to the incident wanted this penalty, who was it actually protecting? Follow the chain with me here because this is where it gets interesting. Wolff manages 2 drivers this season. One of them is a 7-time world champion who left Mercedes for Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton, a name that still carries enormous weight in that garage and in this sport, even sitting in red instead of silver. The other is George Russell, the driver Mercedes built its next era around, the one who's supposed to be the present and the future of that team. And it was Russell, not Wolff, not some anonymous Mercedes statement, who first said publicly that this was just a racing incident. Russell's real frustration, by his own account, wasn't about blame at all. It was that he was down on power on the Kemmel Straight and got swamped by multiple cars behind Hamilton in the run to the corner. In other words, Russell's actual complaint was about pace, not about right or wrong. So when Wolff stood in front of Sky Sports and echoed that sentiment almost word for word, he wasn't defending Russell's honor. He was defending a version of events where his own driver has no real grievance, and where Hamilton, the legend who left his team, doesn't take a hit to his reputation either. Remember that detail. It comes back at the end, and it's the whole reason this story exists. Now, here's a question worth putting to you directly, because this is where the paddock splits into 2 camps. Do you think Wolff was being genuinely fair-minded here, calling it as he saw it? Or was he protecting a legacy that's bigger than any one race result? Tell me in the comments. And if you're on the side of Wolff simply being honest, smash that like button so I can count the votes. Let's keep going because there's more to this than one soundbite. This isn't the only recent moment where Wolff has chosen his words with unusual care around Hamilton. Just hours after the race, Wolff was also quoted saying, "It's quite an honor to drive a Mercedes," a comment that landed publicly amid visible frustration from Russell over his current form and his position inside the team. 2 separate quotes, same weekend, both doing quiet work to manage perception. One softening a penalty against the man who left, one softening the mood of the man who stayed. That's not coincidence. That's a team principal managing two egos and one legacy at the same time in public, using the press as the instrument. And this is the pattern worth watching, because it didn't start this weekend. Every time Hamilton's name comes up in a controversial moment, the instinct from the people who used to manage him and clearly still respect him is to soften the edges. Not because the facts demand it, because the story of Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes was the story that built Wolff's entire era at that team. Protecting that story, even from a rival garage, protects something personal. Here's the part that ties it together. When the stewards ruled Hamilton wholly at fault, they weren't just making a racing decision, they were putting an official record on paper that says the seven-time champion made a mistake that ended his race and briefly ended someone else's. That's a fact. It's on the sheet. No amount of post-race commentary erases it. But public perception doesn't live on the stewards' sheet. It lives in sound bites, in quotes that get repeated by people like David Comerford, by Planet F1, by Sky Sports, by every outlet that ran with Wolff's reaction instead of the stewards' ruling. And Wolff knows that better than almost anyone in this sport. He's spent over a decade managing narratives, not just cars. So ask yourself the question you've been holding on to since the start of this video. Why would a team boss defend the man who ended his own driver's race? Here's the verdict. Wolff wasn't defending fairness. He was defending hierarchy. In his eyes, and in the eyes of a significant part of the sport, Lewis Hamilton is still bigger than the incident, bigger than the penalty, bigger than whatever result comes out of a wet Sunday at Spa. Protecting that status cost Wolff almost nothing. Russell already said he didn't want the penalty overturned in his name, so there's no internal cost to Mercedes, but there's a very real benefit. Wolff gets to be seen, publicly, standing on the side of the legend everyone in this sport still reveres, even after that legend walked out the door to Ferrari. That's the trade, a 5-second penalty on paper in exchange for a public alliance that costs him nothing and buys him goodwill, with the one driver whose reputation still outweighs anyone currently in his own garage. Agree with that reading? Or do you think Wolff was simply calling it like every neutral observer in the paddock saw it? The comments are the courtroom on this one. Make your case. This story is not over. Spa was one weekend, one penalty, one quote. But the pattern between Wolff, Hamilton, and Russell is only getting more complicated as the season goes on. And when the next domino falls in this rivalry, you'll want to be here for it. So subscribe now, drop your verdict in the comments, hit like if you've got a side in this one, and until the next one.